All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, Section 3, Radical Reconstruction, 1867 to 1872. So let's recall that Reconstruction was a battle between Congress and President Johnson. And the latest Reconstruction policy to be fought over was the 14th Amendment. Right, the 14th Amendment. And Johnson was actively touring the country, encouraging states to reject that. The amendment process requires approval from the states. That is unlike passing a law. And so Congress, on the one hand, tried to push the 14th Amendment. Johnson, on the other hand, is trying to reject it, essentially. And so Congress moves further in passing the Reconstruction Acts. So this is Congress's, I doubt that's right, plan for Reconstruction. All right, Congress's plan for Reconstruction. It's technically called the 1867 Military Reconstruction Acts. And of course, this is by the radical Republicans. At this time, the Republicans are the party of the North, right? And when it comes to Reconstruction, they really want to err more on the side of punish the South for what they did. They want much more of a victor's peace. And more importantly, they want to extend rights to Black citizens rather than allow them to be really much at the mercy at state and local governments. The most important thing I would say probably about Congress's plan for Reconstruction is the way that it will be enforced, and that is by dividing up the South into military districts and placing Union generals rather than politicians at their head. This is sometimes referred to as bayonet rule, right? Bayonet rule. The bayonet is the sharp sword thing at the end of a rifle. So you can see the various, maybe I'll use a different color here. But you can see the various districts that Congress sought to create, and each of these would have a Union general that would be in charge of it, and they would more or less force these states to accept the requirements of Reconstruction laid forth by the Congress. So what did Congress want? Well, they wanted mostly a requirement that the 14th Amendment be ratified. Recall the 14th Amendment provides for birthright, citizenship, and equality before the law. All right, that's what they want. So this form of Reconstruction, as you might imagine, is vetoed by President Johnson. However, Congress does override it. And so once this 1867 Military Reconstruction Act passes the Congress, right, over the presidential veto, that essentially puts us into this period known as Radical Reconstruction, where now you have Congress really in the driver's seat, and now they can dictate, Congress can, what Reconstruction is going to look like. However, President Johnson has been a thorn in the side of Congress for quite some time, and Congress moves to impeach him. To impeach means to remove from office. And there's two reasons as to why that is. One is Johnson's continuous vetoes, especially vetoes on laws relating to Reconstruction, right? In some ways, this is kind of like the climax of President versus Congress, right? That ever since Lincoln had been assassinated, really the story of Reconstruction had been this right here, President Johnson versus the Congress. And the impeachment of President Johnson is kind of the last chapter of that story. And Johnson's insistence on maintaining a system of white supremacy, which Congress did not agree with. Congress wanted to extend rights to Black Americans, whereas Johnson was more or less willing to allow states to create their own laws like the Black Codes to create sort of a two-tiered social system. Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act, which requires the president to get Senate approval to dismiss cabinet members. All right, so what's up with this? Well, the Senate, right, is essentially one part of Congress. So this is from the North. Cabinet members. Most of the cabinet members that Johnson had were still remnants of Lincoln, who again was also from the North. And really what Congress is fearing is that Johnson is going to get rid of his cabinet members, those who were kind of residually left over from Lincoln, and incorporate more Southerners into his presidential cabinet, which is like the president's inner circle. And so Congress passes a law requiring President Johnson to get Senate approval in order to do that. Johnson removes members of his cabinet anyways, and that gives the legal justification. So I'll write down here, legal justification for impeachment, which is the process of removing the president. So technically, Johnson is getting impeached for violating this law, for dismissing a cabinet member without Senate approval. The real reason why Johnson is getting impeached is because of this battle we've talked about in the past couple sections over Reconstruction. At the end of the day, Johnson is not removed from office. He is one vote short from being kicked out. Kicked out. Essentially, the way that impeachment works is that to be impeached means that simply a vote will be held. This is a picture of the impeachment proceedings. When that vote was held, there were a couple of Republicans who essentially saved Johnson from being kicked out of office. But this really had the effect of kind of making sure that Johnson remained quiet, right? Quieted, I don't know if that's even a word, Johnson. And so Congress really had the power, right? The radical Republicans really had the power to dictate then what Reconstruction would look like. And once Congress got this, got their plan of Reconstruction into action, once Johnson was almost removed from office, you had a very profound and radical transformation take place in the southern United States following this. First of all, Johnson, his time in office ran out, and Ulysses Grant, who was the Union general, was elected president. He was somebody who supported radical Reconstruction, probably more so Reconstruction. Probably more so than anyone else, was most responsible for Union victory in the Civil War. He was the highest ranking general. He was a war hero for the North. And what the Republicans and Northerners did to win this election was to, quote unquote, wave the bloody shirt. That was to blame the Democrats for the Civil War. This was a political party that was mostly aligned with the South, mostly aligned with secession. They turned out to be on the wrong side of that, but were still and remained a political party and was a political party of the South. But they were not very successful electorally because they more or less, again, received the blame for the Civil War. Congress goes one step further in passing the final Reconstruction Amendment, which is universal manhood suffrage. This allows for black men, the right to vote. And that was passed by Congress and approved by the state. So in terms of Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and 15 is what you should remember. Those are the Reconstruction Amendments. But the 15th Amendment had a kind of maybe an unforeseen side effect or consequence, and that was to ignite this issue of women's suffrage, because the 15th Amendment exclusively, right, allowed for universal manhood suffrage, allowed for men to vote, leaving out women. And this, created a split in civil rights organizations. Think of civil like civilian. So that's the rights of civilians in a population. For some, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were suffragettes, those are those who advocate for the right to vote for women. They opposed the 15th Amendment, specifically because it excluded women, and even went so far as to create new suffragette organizations or new suffrage organizations like the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA. This was a new organization dedicated to getting women the right to vote now, right? That was the important part, because there were other people who advocated for women's suffrage, like Frederick Douglass, who was one of the most well-known abolitionists at the time, but agreed and supported the 15th Amendment more as a stepping stone towards women's suffrage. So whereas Stanton and Anthony viewed the 15th Amendment as being strictly excluding women, people like Frederick Douglass said that it was sort of a stepping stone along the way. And so there was a split in these various organizations. With the 15th Amendment, you had blacks voting in the South, at levels that really had never been seen in America before. This image here is called The First Vote, is a black man voting in the South. This image here is dedicated to celebrating the 15th Amendment, which was the right to vote for black men and the right to hold office. And so there were tremendous political achievements. And what I mean by a radical transformation taking place in the South, this is exactly it. Before the Civil War, blacks in the South were considered to be property, had zero rights. Because Congress, or the North, was able to wrestle Reconstruction away from President Andrew Johnson, not only did you have equal rights being extended, blacks voting, but also blacks holding political office, which again was unprecedented and a radical change, not just in the U.S., but really anywhere in the world. You had political organizations like union leagues. These were political organizations. They had started off in the North, but had spread south, that were instrumental for black communities that helped organize voting. You had office holders from, sheriffs to mayors to school boards. We're talking about not just kind of the big main political offices, but, even just state and local offices were held by African Americans as a result of this. Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram Revels, they were elected to the U.S. Senate. And there are only 100 senators. So, once you're elected to the Senate, we're talking about one of the highest political offices in the land. And during Radical Reconstruction, you had 2 African-American men serving in the Senate representing Southern states, former Confederate states. However, these new political rights and these new political games, this is actually a picture of Hiram Revels right here, created a great sense of resentment towards Reconstruction. Southerners decried, so Southerners, we'll just say cried. The fact that now blacks were in power, they used this term Negro misrule to describe the situation in the South to their northern counterparts. They proclaimed that these new Reconstruction governments were corrupt, and these were efforts to roll back Reconstruction. But it was much more than just, political newspapers, publishers. It was violent. There were those in the South who wanted to redeem the South, to redeem it, or a redeemer, as we sometimes call them, was to restore the South to its antebellum status. And this term antebellum simply just means before the Civil War. And redeemers were willing to use vigilante violence in order to do so. So we'll talk more about how Reconstruction is one of the bloodiest periods in American history, is more than just simply crying out about mistreatment or misrule, but it was actual violence that was being used. And this was portrayed in American culture through not just newspapers and political speeches, but also through things like films. The Birth of a Nation, this was published a little bit later, 1915, I want to say, maybe. Right, so this was posted after Reconstruction, but it really helped to solidify this resentment in the mainstream. And The Birth of a Nation is a film which portrays the quote-unquote redeemers, as the quote-unquote good guys. And so even though the radicals in Congress got firm control of the process during Reconstruction and had the bayonet rule, let's see where we got here, right? Have the military rule in order to enforce this, right? To force 13, 14, and 15 on the South, right? These amendments. It's still going to be a very drawn out, long, and bloody process.